Hello and a very warm welcome to our first live discussion. Please do give us a like. My name's Cherry Hamilton and I'm delighted to be joined today by two guests who are very knowledgeable on the subject of prayer. But before we dive in, let me tell you a little bit about who we are. Coffee and Chat is brought to you by the Christian Inquiry Agency. We're a non-denominational organisation founded by churches together in England. We run the christianity.org.uk website. Here it is down below. And that helps people to find balanced and thoughtful information about the Christian faith. Through our website, lots of people email us with their questions. We get back to each one with a personal and pastoral response. We also have a team of prayers who pray for anybody who asks for it. So, prayer. It's something that Christians all do. It's also something that a lot of people who aren't Christians do, especially at strange times like these. In fact, the Telegraph reported that at the beginning of the pandemic, Google searches for prayer were up 50%. The Guardian also adds that the main subjects for prayer are family, friends, and giving thanks. But what is prayer? And why is it so important? Well, I'm going to let our two guests introduce themselves, tell you a little bit about themselves, and then maybe one or two sentences about their views on prayer. And then we'll dive in a bit deeper. So first of all, Simon, welcome. You're joining us from London.
Thank you. Yeah, it's really good to be here. My name's Simon Woodman, and I'm the minister of Bloomsbury Central Baptist Church, which is on Shaftesbury Avenue in the West End of London. I come originally from Sevenoaks in Kent, but I've lived in Yorkshire and I've lived in the West Country over the years. And in terms of prayer, I've been a Christian for as long as I can remember, and as part of that, prayer has been part of my spirituality. But I think as I've grown and developed as a Christian over the years, so my understanding of what's going on in prayer and my practice of it has also changed and developed. And we may talk a little bit more about that as we go through. But I think it's been a growth and a journey rather than a thing I learned to do that I've just kind of stayed with in the same way.
Brilliant. We look forward to hearing more. Thank you, Simon. And Steve, you're joining us from Birmingham.
Hi, yeah, I'm Steve Hollinghurst. I work for the Diocese of Lichfield, which is the Church of England in sort of Staffordshire, North Shropshire, and a bit of the Black Country, where my role is I'm an evangelism advisor with an environmental focus, sort of marrying those two things together, the importance of ecology and the environment in what the church is about. For me, prayer, unlike Simon, I as a child, I don't remember having any spirituality whatsoever. I was taken to church, but I don't think I liked it very much, to be honest. And when I was old enough, I stopped going. In my mid-teens, I rediscovered spirituality, but actually not initially as a Christian, very much exploring Eastern meditation techniques and things like that as my way in. But actually refound or found for the first time a faith in God through Jesus in my older teens. And so in a sense, I had all these spirituality practices, but I then brought them to bear on my Christian faith. And I think so meditation as a Christian was a rediscovery. There's a whole tradition of Christian meditation, which is part of our tradition of prayer. And for me, it's very much about connecting with God, being in God's presence, allowing God to work in you. So it's that connecting point is central for me in my prayer life.
Brilliant. Well, you've both got quite a lot of story going on there. And it'd be nice to start off with just letting us know how prayer has influenced your life, perhaps at the moment in terms of your spiritual practice of prayer and any particular experiences you may have had with prayer. Either of you start, maybe Simon to start.
Okay. Yeah, so in terms of my current practice of prayer, I'm going to say a bit about what it isn't, perhaps, to start with. Yeah. So I can remember in my teens, I was very much encouraged to keep a prayer journal and to have a list of things that I would pray for every day and then kind of tick them off when God answered them. And I ultimately found that quite difficult because it reduced prayer to being a kind of a wish list or kind of shopping list of almost demands that I would try and place before God. And then I'd worry that if I hadn't said the prayer in the right way, maybe God wouldn't answer it. But if I'd said it in the right way, then God would have answered it. And I got kind of caught up in feelings of, guilt if something I prayed for hadn't happened, that maybe I'd caused that by getting my prayer wrong. So those sorts of things that are very much part of my story, I've kind of moved away from. And I now think about prayer as being at its heart, me focusing my attention on something other than me. That seems to be the very basis of it for me, because I know my capacity to be sort of self-centered and to build my world around myself. My belief that God is other than me and that God is love is at the heart of my faith. And therefore prayer is about giving intentional time and word and thought into aligning myself with something that's not me. It's an exercise in selflessness.
Okay, thank you. And do you pray in a specific way and often?
I don't have a set time of prayer every day, but I do pray regularly. I write prayers for church use, and I often find when I sit down and I write poems as well, and I think a lot of my poetry is prayerful. So I think the exercise of writing and giving shape to my convictions of my heart, that's a way of praying. I do spend time in quiet personal prayer, but I don't, as I say, I don't have a set time every day for that. So there are a variety of practices, from the sort of spontaneous, I now need to pray about this, to a more structured, giving time to shaping and thinking and writing down what it is that I want to bring before God. I think those two are probably my key practices of prayer at the moment. Thank
you. Yes, Steve, what about you? Have you ever had a tick list of prayers, or is that one that you've ever had, or how do you?
Well, firstly, I relate to what Simon has said, but I come at it from the rather unusual angle of my own spiritual background, pre-Christian, in that, as well as getting into Eastern meditation and stuff, I was actually into sort of magical practice for my late teens. So I would simply say one of the things I realized very early on in my Christian journey after that is that prayer is not magic. In magic, the idea is you are in control, and if you do the spell right, you get the result you want. And God is not a magic being in that kind of sense. God isn't a vending machine, to put it another way. So always prayer actually is placing oneself into God's direction, and our actions as Christians in the wider sense in mission are all part of God's mission, what God is doing. So we make ourselves part of God's action in prayer. Now, as an Anglican, I would say I have two practices of prayer. When we get ordained in the Anglican Church, we agree that we will pray in a regular way. And part of one of the resources that we get offered, and it isn't just for people ordained, it's for anybody, is a set daily prayer rhythm. I now have that on my phone. So I can dial up prayers on my phone, and I've often done it on the train or something like that. It's a good use of that time. Now, that's a very formal thing. So there are set words you say and set scriptures for every day and things like that. And part of that is actually a centering of oneself in acknowledging God, in the tradition of the others who've been before you. And I think the great thing, I love the idea of having a set rhythm of reading from the Bible, because it means you read the bits you otherwise probably wouldn't read, and sometimes have to confront them because they can be quite challenging and difficult to deal with. But I then have a far more informal practice of prayer, which I think for me is probably more important, which is sitting and being with God. I particularly like to do that. I don't always do it this way. I particularly like to do this first thing in the morning, is as I'm getting up, is just spend that time, just stop and just be aware of God's presence. And then, yes, there's things that prompt you to prayer. And I think this is getting back to the kind of, what do you pray for? And yes, there's this bigger sense that prayer is about what God's doing in us. But actually, I think there's a thing about a relationship. And so when I am praying for situations or people who are in difficulty, or something like that, actually, I will offer that to God, because that's what I would do to someone I'm in a relationship with.
Yeah.
I don't know, I can't dictate what God will do with me acknowledging that I'm really concerned about this person who is sick, or I'm concerned about this person's job situation, or I'm concerned about my situation.
Yeah.
But I think God wants me to offer those out of that relationship.
Thank you, Steve. What do you think about that, Simon?
A couple of things. Firstly, Steve, I was really struck by your talk about magic. I've long had a conviction that a lot of what passes for Christian prayer is actually sorcery. We're attempting to get God to do our will by actions that we do. So I'm really glad you named that, because that's been something I've felt for a long time. Just wanted to kind of come back in a little bit on the meditation side of it. One of the areas that I've been trying to develop in the last few years has been finding ways of praying more without words. I'm a very wordy person. I mean, I've been a lecturer in a university, and now I preach for a living. I deal in words, and actually finding a way to pray without words has been quite significant. But I've also had to recognize that I'm quite extroverted, and the idea of spending a long time on a regular basis sitting on my own is quite a chore. So it's something I'll do from time to time as an exercise of, now I'm going to spend time at peace on my own in my study before God. But if you ask me to do that every day, I'll just get knackered and give up and go and do something else. So I've found that actually praying through exercise has been really helpful to me in the last 10 years or so. I took up swimming when I moved to London. We have a pool just opposite the church, an outdoor pool, which is amazing. And I go swimming in there, and you're with other people and you're doing something, but you're also very much on your own. And the sort of the idea of meditating through bodily movement and sort of having people around, but also being alone. Since lockdown, when all the pools closed, I've rather randomly decided to take up jogging for the first time in 30 years to see how that went. And it's kind of had a similar effect. So those times of being out there moving has been really helpful to me as part of praying without words, using my body in prayer, that sort of stuff.
Brilliant. Well, that's really interesting. I tend to pray while exercising as well. So what did you want to say on that, Steve?
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the things actually from having done Eastern meditation stuff, but actually it's true in Western meditation. Posture is incredibly important. And so actually by adopting a posture, and of course this is what people do when they kneel to pray, or very simple things like that. By adopting a posture, you engage your body, because we're holistic creatures, and we're all bound together. So prayer is something we do with our bodies, and so actually praying while exercising makes a lot of sense.
Thank you. Now, a lot of people who might be watching this might not necessarily believe in God, or they might have some faith. What about them? Can they pray to God? Will God hear them? What would you say?
I mean, the first thing to say is that surveys show us that a lot of people who don't believe in God do pray, which sounds odd, but it's that kind of sense of reaching out to something. We are relational beings, and I think many people have a sense that there is something bigger, even if they wouldn't name it as God, or even if they're highly doubtful of a God. There is this idea of something out there. And prayer is a way of reaching out and relating to it. So the very simple God, I don't know if you exist, but if you do, is a very good way of beginning in prayer. I started praying before I became a Christian. And I felt that God actually started answering me and directing me. And this, I think, is a whole other thing, is that sense that sometimes we feel, I do anyway, and I think others do, that God speaks to us in prayer, not necessarily in an audible voice that someone would hear if they came into the room, but in something that feels like a voice in your head giving you direction. And that's been an experience quite often in my life, actually.
So have you heard, do you feel that you've heard God speak to you in prayer? Is it prayer a two-way conversation?
It sometimes is. I mean, I think often it's impressions or senses, but sometimes I hear words. So actually, my journey into faith began with God saying to me, look, you've looked at just about every religion in the world, bar Christianity. Why don't you look at Christianity properly rather than just dismissing it? And I thought, well, fair enough. It's true. And that was the beginning of my journey in faith.
Thank you. Yes. Simon, do you have anything to add to that? So I've got...
Yeah, I was thinking about when I was talking earlier about what I think prayer is, and it's about kind of aligning ourselves with the God of love that is beyond ourselves. I don't think you necessarily have to have a fully formed understanding of who the God of love is that is beyond ourselves before we can engage in aligning ourselves with God's will. So I think, the words and language that I put on God from the Christian tradition are the ones that I've grown up with and the ones that I live with. But I don't know that they're absolutely normative for everybody else. And I'm very happy that other people pray to God in different ways from different traditions and from different backgrounds of faith or no faith. And I think if God is love, then God receives and holds those prayers. And God's will it unfolds in the world as we live out in response to the prayers we have made.
Yeah, thank you. Now, you've both talked about our reason for praying being to do with our relationship with God. Is there any time or any sense in which praying for miracles or something specific to happen may happen, do you believe, or ever has happened, or is something worth doing?
I'll start off, and I know Simon has things to offer on this too, because I think this is a really big subject, and it's where people often end up. I think, does God answer prayer? Do miracles happen? All of that kind of thing, and I think it's difficult because we get caught between two poles here, I think, that make the conversation quite hard. At the one end are the people who kind of say, no, that there really are no miracles. God does not work that way. God does not intervene in the world. And actually, therefore, when people think miracles are happening, they're just actually finding a reason to explain something that's really a coincidence or a natural phenomenon. Now, that's a consistent position. It's a logical position, and it's quite easy to hold if it seems a little hopeless sometimes to those people who do want the miraculous. At the other end of the spectrum is the kind of idea that God always wants to do miracles. We have, in the Gospels, the stories about Jesus healing people when they asked and all that kind of thing. So that kind of end of it will want to say, well, God always wants to do the miraculous. The trouble then is that we have the experience of people praying, and sometimes miraculous things seem to happen and sometimes they don't. So we end up trying to explain that kind of problem. I have my own way into it, and I've had my own experiences of this. So I have sometimes prayed for things. I do pray for people for healing or something like that. And sometimes I have witnessed things that I can't explain unless by saying, I think something miraculous has happened. But it doesn't happen all the time. So what's the issue here? And I think very unhelpful things can sometimes be said about this. So I have come across some parts of Christian tradition that want to lay the responsibility on you as the person who's praying, or them as the people being prayed for, and then you get the idea, well, you didn't pray right, and Simon's mentioned that kind of thing already earlier, or you don't have enough faith, or those kind of things. Now, Jesus is quite clear that the size of your faith or how you pray is irrelevant, because it's about what God does, not what we do. We just become the channels for God. So then you get back to that. I think the really difficult question is why does God seem to do things sometimes and not others? And there can be sensible explanations for this. God, of course, has a much bigger picture than we do. So sometimes we're just simply seeing the thing wrongly. But for me, there's a sense here, as Christians, we always are living with the already and the not yet. So God breaks in Jesus into the world in a miraculous way, and I think that's why we see in the testimonies about Jesus so many miracles surrounding him, because in a sense he is. It's almost as if the future we're going to in God's plan, breaks into the present in Jesus. But that happens in us as we pray. So God enters in, but it never is perfect. It's always part of the package. I almost like to think sometimes it's like being in a greenhouse, and part of the greenhouse has been whitewashed over, and gradually God is removing the whitewash so more of the kingdom enters in. But it's almost like the prayer, this all these analogies are bad analogies, but it's almost like prayer hits the greenhouse, and sometimes the miracle breaks through as a sign of what is to come, but it doesn't happen all the time. And I don't think anyone's responsible for that. I think we just live with that already and not yet reality.
Thank you, Simon. You would
yeah.
like to...
I think I'm been fairly public on this before. I sit probably a little bit more at the miracle skeptic end of the do the laws of nature get broken by God's divine intervention kind of thing. But I know we're talking here more about we're having a conversation about prayer rather than miracles. But the two go together in one sense. Is it acceptable to pray for a miracle? I pray for all sorts of things because I figure there's no harm in praying. And a world in which a prayer has been offered is a different world to the world would be if that prayer had never been offered. So a world in which I have given time to praying for someone who is sick, praying for their healing, praying for their wholeness, is a different world to the world in which I had not prayed that. So something happens in the act of prayer. I suspect what happens is that in the community in which the prayer is offered and in the life of the person offering the prayer, that is where God's intervention in the world begins to be made known. So I tend to think God's action in the world is primarily through people rather than through twiddling with the laws of nature. I've yet to experience a twiddling with the laws of nature answer to my prayers. I have often experienced the world being made differently as a result of prayers, in terms of praying for people who need healing and people who are dying. This is the stock in trade of ministers. I don't think that's a hopeless thing to do, but I also don't expect that the person who's in the terminal stages of Alzheimer's will miraculously recover as a result of me praying for them. I think that would be a fairly unhelpful thing to pray for at that point. So I tend to think that it's okay to pray, and it's good to pray, and it's helpful to pray, but we have to have in mind how we think that our prayers are likely to be answered, and to be a bit kind of realistic about what it is God does and how God works.
Okay, well, thank you. Two slightly different views there. Apparently we've got a question from our Facebook chat, which is coming up on the screen. Okay, yes, please. What helps you get into that place of prayer? Okay, great question. Who wants to take that?
I'll start off. I think it's a thing about intending to. For me, I get back to things I said about posture. So actually, all I will simply do is I need to be in a place where I can not be interrupted. Now that can be a public place. You can pray on a train or walking down a street, but you don't want to be interrupted by somebody who will take your attention to them rather than attention to God. But very often I will just simply move my sitting posture to get into a place of prayer. So if I'm sitting back in a chair, which I am now, I will often sit to the front of the chair, which kind of puts you in a place of balance. And actually then also I sometimes concentrate on my breathing and just take slightly deeper breaths, and you get into that place where you can really concentrate on God. And that for me works, so I can slip myself into that. Now I think surroundings matter too. I absolutely love being with God in the natural world. So actually outside is my favorite place to meet with God. I absolutely love the sound of running water too. So sit me in a wood by a stream and I am totally in the zone. But actually you can do that anywhere. You have that place inside you, so you can do it walking down the street. It's that concentration.
That's really interesting. Thank you. What about you, Simon? Do you have a...
I'd echo the natural world thing. I mean, Liz and I have just had a fortnight in Scotland, driving around, and it was awe-inspiring in every sense of the word. Or there, you feel the presence of God through the majesty of creation. So I really, really resonate with that. I think also for me, praying people helps me get into a place of prayer. To pick up kind of Chris's question there, if I sit down and just sort of try and pray, I kind of think, oh, I don't know what to do. But actually praying for my family, praying for my church, praying for people who I know need holding before God, it's not quite the prayer list of my teens, but the discipline of giving time to holding those issues, and particularly those people that I want to know more of God's love in their life, holding them before God in that prayer. That helps me enter a place of prayerfulness in a way that I might struggle to get to otherwise.
Thank you. Yes. Well, we've only got a couple of minutes left, so I wonder if either of you can recommend any resources or any sort of tips for people who want to start thinking about prayer.
Very quickly, there are some fantastic telephone apps now for prayer. Most of us have a smartphone. There are some really, really good things. So just have a search to, put prayer into your app store and see what you get. There's some fabulous stuff out there. I
use those a lot, yes. Simon?
Is this where I'm supposed to say check out christianity.org.uk?
It wasn't a plan, to be honest. You can name any specifics if that's helpful, but I have to say I use something called Pray As You Go, and also Lectio 365, which are quite similar, quite meditative prayer apps that you can use when you're walking along. There are many other things out there.
Yeah, they're both excellent. I'd also say Rowan Williams has written some fantastic stuff on prayer. So check out books by Rowan Williams.
I'm looking that up. Okay, we've got 1 or 2 minutes left. So have you got any more thoughts that we haven't covered yet on prayer or helping people to get started with praying?
I would say just give it a go. Find out what works for you. I mean, Steve and I have just been sharing how we've got slightly different approaches and different experiences. And I don't think it's that, one of us is right and one of us is wrong. Different people have different ways of getting into prayer. So try different stuff, cast around, see what works for you. I would say just give it a go.
Brilliant.
Prayer is about relationship, and we are part of that relationship as well as God. So there's an inevitability about prayer and personality, I think. So yes, I totally share what Simon's just said.
Brilliant. Well, I'd just like to thank you both very, very much for your time and your wisdom today. And thank you for everybody else who's joined us today and sent in your questions. If anybody would like to know any more about prayer, do head over to our website. On the front page, you'll find a link to our features page on prayer. So go over to that. We'll be doing another one of these in about a month's time, which will be on grief and loss. So if you'd like to join us then, please do. We'll be putting more information on our website, on Facebook and on Twitter. Until then, take care, and thank you so much for being with us today.